Good afternoon and welcome to the 2022 Be Original Americas Virtual Student Fellowship. Thank you for tuning in. We're excited to be joined by Fferrone Design founder and design director Felicia Ferrone for this afternoon's presentation. Now I'm happy to introduce today's speaker, Felicia. Felicia studied architecture at Miami University, Ohio, before moving to Milan, where her experiences with some of Italy's most notable designers helped shape her belief in blurring boundaries and that all design exists in relation to its surroundings. Her work is included in the Art Institute of Chicago's permanent collection, and her designs have been widely exhibited and published internationally. She is currently Director of Undergraduate Studies in Industrial Design and professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She also previously lectured at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for many years. Felicia, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining from all parts of the world. I wanted to share with you a couple different aspects of my practice, but really focusing on this idea of how design can act as a angle for entrepreneurship and how that creates agency. So a little bit about my background. So as Ben mentioned, I actually studied architecture and not design. And it was, as he mentioned, I moved to Milan right after I graduated from undergrad, and it was there that I discovered the world of design. So it was all through the design week, which is every April. And this is a scene, this is typical, where the city just, it's kind of like Halloween, but for designers. And it lasts pretty much 7 days, morning till night. And it was there that I really sort of fell in love with design and started to understand it, not just as an end product, but sort of as a vehicle. So again, just some quick snapshots to really show how sort of whimsical and just all the experiences that can kind of come from that. It was in Milan, where mainly where I worked as an architect in various studios, but it was there that that I created the first design piece, and which led me to this piece, which is the Revolution collection. And this was a simple sketch I made on a Sunday while I was still living there. And this idea of how do I bring this out into the world? So I started, like most designers are taught, you go to companies and you pitch your ideas to them in the hopes that they pick it up for their line, and that they would then develop it for you. And in exchange, you would get a percentage royalties, which would be your compensation for your design ideas and any sort of contribution in terms of design development for them. So I had designed this piece. It's a reversible glass. The idea of one unit being a water side versus a wine side, because it really kind of came from these really big elaborate dinners in Italy, with many, many friends and many different drinks. And by the end, it was very chaotic. So my idea was, how do you really sort of simplify this and really sort of alter the landscape of the table? Because of my experience in Milan, where all the famous designers that we think of were actually all trained as architects. And so it was there that this blurring of the boundaries is really understanding how an object can exist within a complex system. And then it doesn't really exist on its own. You've got to consider it both as the object within its own system or family of objects, and then how that relates to its context as well. So this was the bowl, and I went on to develop a series of other pieces. And I started the traditional pathway of approaching companies. So what I found was, and through several different experiences over the course of my professional years, was really working through royalties, is that I just quickly discovered that you have no control, you have no agency over what your creation is and how it gets developed. and even how it gets photographed, for example. This was a photograph from a company I was working with early on, and I just felt like the imagery didn't really tell the full story. And if the full story isn't told, it's unlikely that the product will capture the imagination of the audience and therefore not sell, which means no royalties, no compensation. So I found this to be a very challenging experience because you leave school where you are busy really controlling every aspect of your designs, from how they're presented to, from the concept to presentation. And so to sort of relinquish control at that point, I just found it very unsettling, and just also kind of feels like, having to figure out the lunchroom in middle school and see if you can eat with the cool kids and if they'll allow you to hang with them or not. And again, it was just another aspect that I personally did not enjoy. So after this sort of experience, I decided to really sort of explore doing this on my own. And at that time, I had seen a few people, an architect, a couple other designers start to put their own work into the world under their own labels, under their own brands. And it was there that I really could see that you could control every aspect of your work, from, how it's put into the world, what's the distribution model, how it's photographed, the story it tells, who you work with, how you work, and also considering, the earning potential of something. So, it's an entrepreneurship for those of you who are interested in it or even considering it. It's certainly not the easy path forward, but it really does provide this opportunity, I feel, and now more than ever, to really find your niche and find the people who will respond to your work. And so it's sort of through this opportunity that you make opportunities for yourself. So I eventually ended the contract with the company and was able to develop for the first time the entire collection, actually, as they had been conceived back in 2001. And so by doing that, I was able to really kind of fulfill this dream I had of what the collection would be. And so I do find very much it's a risk, but by putting something out there, you really are able to see how people respond and really take into consideration the context in which you're presenting your work. And it's through that I was able to continue to develop this series, really kind of concentrate on how the products are captured in terms of image, the storytelling, the narrative, and really helping people understand how it functions all together, and even playing around with different things. This is actually part of the permanent collection at the Art Institute. And so again, from the simple kernel of an idea, sort of to end up at this place, I really believe wholeheartedly that if you are really persistent and dogged in your determination, that you can put things into the world and people will find you. So, but this is where it all began. So this was actually the very first show I did. It was 11 years ago, and it was together with a group of young designers, mostly all out of New York. And you can see here my collection. And it was all put together by Kyle Mead, who created the American Design Club. And it was when Chen and Kai launched, Fort Standard launched, Pat Kim launched, I'm sure, and many others, but I trust you would know them as designers as well. So it was this real moment where all of us sort of really stepped onto the stage at the Javits Center in New York for the New York Now gift fair, where it was the first opportunity to encounter a broader commercial audience. So that was my very first collection, the Revolution, which was hyper minimal. And at that point, I wanted to explore sort of a maximalist approach. And so started designing something that really was in as much contrast as I could um, create to the revolution. And I started working with fluted glass, which actually up until this time was really only used in industrial lighting. And so this was the first time that was really brought into the context of um, a domesticated object that one would interact with personally and on a daily basis. So here you can see the fluting is on the interior to kind of really give you a sense. This was another early collection, the tulip collection. A lot of my work goes into exploring and challenging archetypes. And this was inspired very much by the French bistro glass, the sort of everyday anonymous glass that's quite small, that I always found had a very strong sort of personality to it, and something that brought me great joy, just in its proportion and the overall scale of it. This was a later collection, the May collection, which really kind of explores, again, in this case, the two materials, the smooth and the fluted glass, and really kind of plays with tension and proportion in terms of this really sort of very tight center point between the volumes. A number of my glassware, because it was really sort of challenging expectations and challenging archetypes, has ended up in many films, from M. Night Shyamalan's film Old, where the glasses actually kind of were cast as supporting characters to the narrative, to Westworld, one of the early seasons, to many sci-fi films. This is Oblivion, and then this is Solo, and there are actually a number coming out or that are out now as well, very much placed in this creating milieu and really kind of defining set. So I want to kind of share with you where this all comes from for me. And I think, and when I teach, I very much talk to students about the importance of observing what's around them. And it's really about noticing everything. It could be noticing a curb cut. It could be noticing an anonymous floor patterning. It could be a sculpture. It could be something completely random and bizarre, but quite fun, an installation, or work of a great master, such as Castelvecchio and Carlo Scarpa. For me, it's really this idea of it's in everything around you, and just, eyes open and constantly. I very much enjoy, there are a few spots in Milan where there are these amazing industrial cast iron grates in the sidewalk. And the moment I saw them, all I could think of is a trivet, for a hot item. And so this idea of, very often my work will also sort of explore materiality and context change, where an industrial object then turns into an object of function in daily living. Something else that I'm often inspired by is architecture. So this is the Pantheon in Rome, of course, with its fabulous oculus and coffered ceilings, as well as this really dramatic, colorful floor, which then I translated into this limited edition series, the Shift Table, which really sort of explores these notions of sort of how furniture can be small scale architecture. Sort of other opportunities I created was, something as simple as the Brita pitcher, which would live on my countertop. And I really wanted something that sort of wasn't the plastic, which didn't work in my environment, and it would sort of get scratched and things. And so really looking at how we can create timeless objects, something of high function, and yet using sort of an industrialized system, and just making it smarter. And so by not working on brief, it's really up to me in this case, in this whole idea of how design can act as agency in entrepreneurship, that it really allows you to tell the story and narrative that you want to tell based on what you see in terms of observations, functions, of things you need even. It can start with you. And so I think this is a good example. This is another example of just, again, daily observations, thinking about how people buy flowers. For example, sometimes it's a single stem, sometimes it's a small bunch, perhaps that you picked from your yard, or a large bouquet. And really taking into consideration how an object, how a person attaches to an object, the emotional attachment, and really thinking about how when something's asymmetrical and if it's positioned in different ways, it almost seems like a new object each time that you encounter it. And so really sort of playing around with this idea of how do you make something, how could something be more timeless and sort of continue to surprise and delight. And this is an example that I was playing with. There's stainless steel metal vases that are all hand sprayed. And it allows for this idea of, again, it's this ever changing, ever dynamic object that in the hopes is that one doesn't grow tired of it in this very disposable culture we live in now. But this belief and value that of this notion of timeless design and how we can sort of really continue to desire to interact with the objects that we possess. This is another example. Some of my work also explores this idea of blending of typologies, much like the French word, the portmanteau. You know, if you think like motel, which is from motor and hotel, and combining of functions to create an even greater sort of solution for those that contain, that hold the piece. So for example, this is a flower vase and candle holder. And it's sort of, its asymmetrical T shape also allows for lots of opportunities in terms of continuous interaction with it, in terms of how it's positioned on a table in context. This piece here that really explores obviously a candelabra and a serving piece. And it can also be brought up to a much larger scale as well. Living in Chicago, where, you know, the weather is terrible a lot of the year, you know, you sort of end up with really terrible places, you know, little plastic things for, you know, your wet umbrella or your wet boots, you know, in hall trees or hopefully a coat closet or something. I was living in a space that didn't have a coat closet and needed a place where everything could kind of live. And so this piece here, the Albert, really kind of was born out of this function of why aren't these moments of daily living combined? Like, why don't we come in and take off our wet things as we hang up our coat as well? So, and it can start in a really simple way. I think that's the one of the most exciting things about entrepreneurship is that it's really about being resourceful and being creative in terms of how you go about everything in your business and your designs. So for example, here it's, you know, simply, you know, taking a mop and some paper and scotch tape and cardboard and just kind of quickly mocking up the idea to really even test to see if it's worth it or not, and how it begins to function, and then how you might refine the scale, and then how you might define and develop the family of objects as well. This was something else, again, a combination of both a side table and a sort of catch-all or magazine table. Some of my favorite materials are cardboard and dowel rods, super inexpensive and really easy to work with. And prototyping at full scale is hugely important. Again, in this whole idea, because being an entrepreneur, you don't necessarily have unlimited funds to prototype things at scale for real. And so by really kind of testing it out in low fidelity materials, it really gives you an opportunity to make sure that your investment is the right one at the right time and place for you to build a full scale with a fabricator, for example, or final materials if you're building yourself. So I thought this was kind of a fun example of the finished one, obviously, just as it was assembled pre-finish, and then with the original cardboard, and then just sort of a example of the catch-all. So I wanted to also share this project. It happened to come about through Food and Wine magazine a number of years ago, where I was invited with a number of chefs and artists and other designers to reinvent the archetypal wine bottle. That was the brief. And their idea was just something kind of fun for the magazine, for the issue. Nothing really beyond that, just kind of a call for ideas. And so I was invited to do this and quite excited because, I really believe in kind of like trying to challenge archetypes and really sort of challenge our expectations of them. And so I very often my part of my design process is precedence. Look at things that have come before. I often refer back to design history. I think it's hugely critical in a designer's understanding of what they're doing today and understanding what came before. And so kind of looking back at wine bottles, since the dawn of time, basically, they were always basically the same. And I realized kind of at the 9th hour before the project was due that the one thing that was always the same in all of them is that the opening or the aperture was concentric with the body of the bottle when you look down, for example, as though you're looking down in plan on the bottle. And I realized that was the moment that really kind of allowed me a move. And so I realized by aligning the aperture, the side of the aperture, to be aligned with the wall of the body of the bottle, that it provided this really unique shape that both allows for, sort of graphic identity to be unique because perhaps you use the small wall here, you could use this shoulder section, you could sort of use the right side or the left side, or even this straight wall for your graphic identity. And so it really allows for this one object to have these many different faces. And again, it goes back to that idea of like, if it allows you to continually use it and reconsider it, you have more attachments. And in this case, it would be, companies producing the wine and the designers that do the labeling and all of that. It just sort of is this really dynamic canvas. And once sort of that was discovered, I realized it had this amazing nesting ability. And it's through this nesting ability that your carbon footprint in shipping is reduced by about 50%, as is the packaging. So you need about 50% less packaging than you would for the standard bottles. So we're saving on material costs, carbon, everything that goes into packaging, as well as shipping. As we know, it's shipped, wine's shipped all over the world. So this is really, it sort of went from, what was simply an object and developed into a system. And then the system had dramatic impact on other ramifications, such as, sustainability and conversations around ecology. And I think this is something that then I decided sort of, it got published in the magazine and that was all great, but I just felt like there was something more that needed to come of this. And so I actually decided to, reach out to a patent attorney and explore this with them. And, went on to, really kind of move through the patenting process. And so it's received a utility patent as well as 2 different design patents. And then it also has European registration. And this is something I've just done all on my own, and again, it goes back that because I wanted to see the project come to life. and not necessarily have to wait for someone to find me or, let me sit at their lunchroom table. That, it's sort of through this that I get to feel fully expressed as a designer. And it's through then taking that, moving into the next step, which is entrepreneurship and doing something with these ideas. So I don't know if you can see here, but the top, I founded my company, Fferrone Design, back in 2010, when I sort of made a dramatic shift from a very secure day job that was wonderful into sort of stepping off into the unknown, starting my company. I also began teaching at that time. And that was 2010. And, sort of around 2016, I started, meeting more sort of international clientele as far as, retailers, and realized I was very limited by being based in the US in terms of like high design. And so, I sort of explored the idea of working with distributors. Again, that goes back to the traditional models. As designer is to royalties, sort of, product distribution would be to a distributor. So you sort of rely on an external partner, not partner per se, but for service model. But then they kind of control everything, who the work is sold to, sort of various aspects. And, just kind of given my experience and thinking back through my years, I sort of got to a point where I thought I felt the best thing for me would be to do my own distribution. And so in 2018, I decided to open a company in Italy, which is a little crazy given all the craziness that goes into anything fiscal in Italy, and all the red tape. But I decided that really was best. And so it's through opening that now I can really expand the brand into Europe, UK, Middle East, Asia, and Africa. And so that's something I'm particularly proud of kind of really having these two companies that allow me sort of access to the global markets. So I often think about this. Entrepreneurship is not easy. And I think it really comes down to tenacity, being extremely persistent and just sort of not letting things go until you've sort of like gotten a piece. This could even be a design, right? Pushing a design until it's absolutely where you feel like it's, reached its true essence. It could be setting up a distribution system, or it could be anything, but it's really this idea of like absolute sort of relentless pursuit, as well as being resourceful. As designers, we're all creatives, right? It's all about, finding the creative solution and really thinking, outside of the box, of course. And then I think the other thing that's really important for a design entrepreneur is really understanding design history, precedents, and as well as the contemporary market. And so I feel like this is sort of this idea that sort of is all the back end, that yes, manifests in the designs themselves, but also in how those designs are accessed by the public. So I just want to share with you this last thing, and it's I feel like I've been very fortunate in my career. I also know I've worked incredibly hard, long hours and everything, which I've enjoyed. But this, going back to how I originally started, of this idea, if you put your sort of vision into the future, that people will find you. And hopefully most of you are familiar with this book that came out a year ago, actually, by Fiden. And it was a survey of about 200 women designers who shaped the history of design. And the piece that was selected for this by me was my Revolution collection, which is my very first collection. And I think it's the fact that it means so much to me, and that that was the first attempt I made to put anything out into the world. And that's the one that really still resonates most with people. And so it is this idea of, dogged determination, being relentless and pursuing your vision and executing on your vision as you see. Because very often as creatives, people can't always see what you see. And so it's really up to you to make sure that you can get it out into the world and, have the story so that other people can at that point understand it as you see it. So that is everything I kind of wanted to share with you today. Um,
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Felicia. We really appreciate your time and some really amazing insights into not just your work, but into, you know, being an entrepreneur in the world of design and some great advice. We have had some great questions come in. So I wanted to jump in with just a couple to get started. What inspired you when you first got into the world of design? What inspired you to explore glassware in particular when you were
mm,
starting out?
that's that's interesting because I was always so I'm really quite known for the glassware because I think it really challenged the boundaries. At the time, I was really kind of the first one doing glassware in a very contemporary sort of way. But it was just sort of the first thing that kind of fell out of my sketchbook. But I had been sketching, everything from, architecture details and things to furniture and lighting. So it just sort of happened that that one, and I can't even tell you why that one was the thing I picked to start with. But I did. I started in a very, simple way. I found someone who could make it. I found a photographer. We shot it. I tried to get it into the hands of press and things like that. So um, it just so happens that, uh, it was glass. It wasn't necessarily like my intent to focus in that area.
Another a question in a similar vein is because you came from the world of architecture, what other areas of design influence you now?
Mm. So it's everything. Um, you know, everything in the applied art. So, exhibit design, architecture, I still travel and try to see, but again, it can be a really banal thing that I see in an alley somewhere, or it can be like a Tadao Ando museum in Japan. Um, it can be, elements of fashion. Um, it really is everything. I mean, I think inspiration is everywhere. It can be on the street, it can be high design, it can be low design, it can be anonymous. And so for me, it's not really a single source, but just always like scanning, and my phone is just filled with a million photos of just stuff I see constantly
Right.
that I find inspiring. I don't always do stuff with it, but
Great. How much time do you typically spend on a project? For example, the wine bottle redesign.
mhm. So for me, I think because of sort of where I worked in the past, it was just design, design, design. Now it was in a sort of more of an architectural realm, but I learned to be quite fast at it. Um, and the wine bottle, I think, was probably 40 to 60 hours. Because again, it goes into research. It's a lot of like, okay, what are the precedents? Let's look up, the history of wine bottles. It's really kind of digging through that to really kind of understand it and also understand the gaps, right? Because the whole idea is we're all here, because we all believe in original design, right? So it is very much like if it's a chair, let's say, it's look through, all the chairs that exist and try and find a gap. So that takes time. Um, and really kind of sorting things out. But I am not a 3 month, 6 month kind of person. It's usually pretty quick, right? I generally say like, nah, it's always about 40 hours between like initial sketch to like something where I'm like, aha, this is it.
Great. Based on your experience, and given that you are actively teaching currently, what advice would you give to students that they might not get in the classroom?
Um, one. I think. Well, one thing I think um, people don't talk about is just paying attention to the world around them. I think that's something I really drive into all my students when I have them in class. And um, I know as faculty and things like that, we all know that, but I don't know that we really know that, like on a daily, hour by hour kind of basis. Um, so I would say that's a huge thing. And also this idea of make opportunities for yourself. I think that's something that we don't talk about enough. Um, and in this day and age that we live in where nothing's super secure and, and a lot of times also a lot of us don't have connections. I had no connections. I didn't speak Italian when I moved to Italy. I didn't know anyone. I showed up, I knew no one. I had a hotel booked for like 4 nights. So it really comes down to making opportunities for yourself to bridge the gap of like, I have no connections, I have no money, but I have all these ideas. And so I think that's something, and it goes back to this idea of like design as agency and entrepreneurship as empowerment, that I think more than ever, that's what we need. That's what I hope to instill in my students. Um, and that things can be scary, but you do it anyway.
Do you have any advice for bridging those gaps and making the connections? And I know today it's a much more digital world than it was even 3 years ago, and obviously different than when you first moved to Milan. But maybe in today's world, do you have any advice for bridging the gap for the students that might be in the not speaking Italian
Uh,
worlds of design?
right. Um, um, I think it's just trying. I think it's just not, it's about not being afraid to just try. Um, you know, kind of this idea of like MVP, like, minimal viable, product, in the tech world, I often call it the minimal viable prototype, if just try things, I don't think I think in that aspect, maybe it's not any different than, back in the 90s when I moved, unless I'm maybe not answering your question correctly.
Yeah.
Um, but I think the bridging of the gap is simply in the effort and sort of the blind courage that sort of overcomes the fear factor.
Great. We have a couple more questions. Is acting as an entrepreneur? What are the ways that you try to challenge the archetype of the royalty based designer? I know you went into this a little
Mm.
bit earlier, but some of the ways that you're pushing back against that traditional model.
Yeah, just doing my own stuff. Then I get to decide kind of, what percentage I take away from the finished object. Um, yeah, and again, it's just writing your own ticket. It's you deciding. I, you can't even say there's a market cap in things because if you ever look on like a first dibs or first I reference that because you can see pricing, right? If you go think about like a gallery like an art company or something, you don't know the prices. um you can see one table that's priced at $35,000 and one that's almost identical in essence, let's say, not as a copy, but just sort of very similar typology that's maybe priced at 4, and you wonder why, um, and so, I think that's a great example of someone just deciding what what it is that, they feel it's worth. And if they can find a market to meet them there, you know, I think that's a way to push back on this idea of royalties. Because I think royalties are, really tough. Some companies do, a couple percentage points of like wholesale. Some do first cost, which means production cost, like production, like in the factory. And a lot of these companies, that you probably get, like if you think about a Target or, Crate and Barrel or something, um, it's cost of something in Indonesia, which is low because the ultimate price point is quite low. Um, so it's this idea that you can sell less actually and probably make more than the royalties if you sold 20 pieces as opposed to like 20,000 where you have no control. So I think in in terms of like authoring your own work. It's what allows that. And I mean, we see this too, like thinking about like, Schitt's Creek and Dan Levy, or, Phoebe Waller-Bridge and, Fleabag, like, or Taylor Swift remastering all her songs. Like we see this all the time, and I think we just don't talk about it in design as much.
Right.
But you see examples of it. And I find all those people super inspiring because they're just like, I have an idea, I'm gonna write it, I'm gonna direct it, star in it, produce it, which is, very much what I think ultimately in some way my work, um, uh, one way I navigate the world.
Great. In similar kind of vein about how you approach the your practice in the world of design, how does your role as a professor and as the director of undergraduate studies, how does that influence your work at all?
Oh, terribly so. I liken it to, one, I absolutely love it. And I love our students at UIC. So that alone inspires me greatly. But for me personally, I liken it sort of to elite training because, weekly I'm tasked with making sure the human in front of me understands what I'm saying and I'm understanding what they're saying. And I have to find a way to articulate what in their design maybe isn't working so well so that they can find a way to move forward. So it's this constant like training for me in terms of like what's not right with it, what is working for it, working really well. Um, how do you sort of think about objects and just sort of general exposure? But so much of it comes down to this like constant practice for me, which really is like, like a gym workout or something. That really keeps me, I think, very like, um, it keeps me, it forces me to think very critically also, you
Right.
know,
Right.
so.
Great. All right. Our final question to wrap up is, do you have any recommendations for the students today of maybe other unexpected voices or creative leaders in the industry that are also pushing boundaries that are worth looking into or connecting with and making waves, I guess?
Oh, wow, wow, I'm kind of blown away by that one. Um, okay, I think when I'm maybe, I don't have any like particular references, but the ones I guess I'm most fascinated by, there's a woman I follow on Instagram, and I'm not even sure entirely her background, might be more like fine arts, like wood sculpture, but just like really pushing what is just a wonderful boundary of like lives on a farm and has a bunch of like has alpacas and but makes these gorgeous pieces. And I think now more than ever, the pandemic has allowed people to sort of live anywhere and explore different lifestyles. And so I guess that's something I find particularly inspiring, in terms of like total living, sort of creatively. I've been around a lot. It's rare that I see things that like really capture my imagination. It's probably now more in other realms like dance and choreography, or something kind of like one step removed from design per se. um yeah, but I think again, it's you can find inspiration anywhere if you're looking hard enough.
Yeah, those the unexpected sources of inspirations are sometimes the best.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. It was a pleasure to have you, and thank you for sharing your insights. Thank you for everyone who attended today as well.